Greetings and welcome to this afternoon's plenary session. I am Lee Syria, President and CEO of United Church Homes and Services and past member of the Chisholm Board of Directors. I am pleased to introduce this afternoon's plenary session on predictions for a post-pandemic era. A year ago, we couldn't have foreseen the tidal wave that COVID-19 would produce. It's good to finally be at a point where we can actually begin to think about a time beyond the pandemic. I cannot think of two better people to help us today than our speakers, Tommy Brewer, Managing Director with Ziegler, and Lisa McCracken, Director of Senior Living Research with Ziegler. Before I turn the program over to Tommy and Lisa, I would like to say a huge thank you to Ziegler's platinum sponsorship of this year's annual gathering. Ziegler has sponsored our annual gatherings for over 5 years. And Chisholm is especially grateful for their support in bringing this year's annual gathering into being. After their presentation, there will be a live Q&A session, so I encourage you to post your thoughts and questions in the chat box during the session. And now I invite you to listen to Tommy Brewer and Lisa McCracken talk about their predictions for a post-pandemic era.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here with all of you as part of the Chisholm virtual annual gathering. Sorry we're not able to be with all of you in person. I know we've been able to join you the last several years at your annual meeting, but we're glad to be a part of this once again with you, even though it may be virtual. So this is Lisa McCracken. I'm the Director of Senior Living Research with Ziegler, and I'm joined by Tommy Brewer, who's the Managing Director with Ziegler as well. And we're going to tag team today's session, and this is an advanced recorded session, so I just will let you know that we'll have the opportunity to be with you live at the end after the PowerPoint session to go through some Q&A, give any potential updates. We know particularly Tommy's section, which is going to talk a lot about government stimulus funds, PPP funds, and really the economic outlook that can change on a weekly basis. So we'll have some healthy dialogue here at the end before we wrap up for the day. So want to just thank you all again. Want to thank Chisholm for the opportunity to be a premier sponsor. Once again, I think we've done that for the last 5+ years and been a partner to all of you. And want to acknowledge all the hard work that all of you have put in really the past year now through the pandemic. And it's hit every organization a little different way, hit all of us personally, and we appreciate your perseverance and dedication to those that you serve. So brief just introduction or overview of the table of contents. So I'm going to do a brief introduction, just who Ziegler is. Some of you may be more familiar with us than others. Some observations from the past year. As we know, as we transitioned from 2020 to 2021, it wasn't just a light switch change. Many of us wish that it was. We could put 2020 fully behind us, but we're continuing with a lot of the changes that took place through 2020. And one of the things we want to talk about is, as we look back on the past year and look ahead, what's here to stay? What do we see sort of phasing out? People talk about a new normal, and I think that new normal is constantly changing. So change is inevitable without a doubt. But I want to talk about that. And then Tommy, who is our internal expert around everything government stimulus and PPP loans, CARES Act, and so forth. He will take it through the end before we get into the Q&A and discussion. So just briefly, Ziegler is a privately held investment banking firm. We are headquartered in Chicago. We've been around since 1902. The core of what we do is investment banking. We also have an active sales and trading desk and capital markets platform, as well as some proprietary investments. Some of you on the aging services or long-term care group have been a part of our Ziegler linkage funds, which is investing in technology, and that's in that proprietary investments fund. But we are capital advisors, and we help not-for-profits across a number of different sectors really tap into funds that they need. This is a map that just shows a bit of our history and also where we are. We have just shy of 200 individuals that support our various investment banking platforms, and you can see where we're headquartered in Chicago and where we are based. I'm based in Pennsylvania, and Tommy works out of our Richmond office. This is a graphic that really shows a lot of our, I call them buckets for lack of a sophisticated term, of where we support different not-for-profit sectors. So senior living, healthcare, we work with a number of hospitals, health systems. We have a very active education practice, so higher education, charter schools, and then a corporate finance healthcare practice, which has been very active with a lot of companies, physicians' practices that may be merging, selling, raising funds. And so we'd like to bring all of those together, hopefully in a really nice comprehensive picture for all of you in educational sessions like this. That's our senior living team. Somewhere on there, I think you'll find me on the bottom right there. And then Tommy Brewer, again, who's out of our Richmond office on the bottom left there. This just shows, for those of you in the senior living world, that you can see that we've been very active in the leader, really, on financings. This is bond financings that we've done going back to the year 2000, and we've been the market leader for a number of years and worked very hard to achieve that and to maintain it as well. So that's background on Ziegler. So I want to transition into some general observations from the past year, and I thought, how do I want to approach this? And these are some graphics. These are by no means every graphic possible. I stayed away from the political stuff. I thought we don't need to go there today. We're all very well aware of what a year was in that regard. But clearly, we as a society had to pivot pretty quickly as the pandemic hit. So whether that was rushing to get toilet paper, whether that was, children now going to remote learning, parents working out of the home, it's been an interesting year, and then we know that all of us were eager to say goodbye to the past year and, learn from it and grow, and hopefully are optimistic that 2021, at least a partial year, will be a little bit better. But what's interesting is I did pull a headline from the bottom left. We've been in this healthcare pandemic, and Tommy's going to talk more about the economic outlook and so forth, but it's really been a tale of two worlds, because economically, when you look at the stock market and the Dow Jones, and if many of you have investments, we recovered and did pretty darn well and actually hit some record highs in 2020, which is amazing if you think about it. The fact that we are in a global pandemic, and that's sort of where things are. Other economic indicators with unemployment and things of that nature, are still struggling, but the housing market has still been very healthy, so that has helped a number of sectors as well. So there's been a bit of a mixed bag in terms of some of the economic difficulties, that we as a country have faced. And I just thought that was a fun little quote there. Before I agree to 2021, I want to watch the trailer first. So we know we've been all watching a lot of Netflix trailers and Amazon Prime and have been glued to those stations as well. So what are some key themes? And I'm sure among the CHISM membership, this is very true. We have seen a very significant variation of impact depending on the organization. And this has been a lot of the theme throughout the past year. It really depends on the organization. Some have weathered it better than others. One of the things that we have found is a number of the organizations and companies in general that have been able to be nimble and have some flexibility with their business models were at an advantage. I mean, one very simple example of that is you think of organizations that already had telemedicine and telehealth in place and didn't need to rush into adoption and try to figure out how to address some of that. So some of those organizations were a little ahead of the curve when we had to react to the pandemic. So clearly a key theme in that. The other thing is that it is not getting any easier. So regardless of what your mission is, what your service is, whether you are in social services, children and families, care for seniors, homeless, it has been really hard to be able to be in this alone. So when we say that, I mean, when you look at your organization, the smaller organizations with very limited resources have struggled. And we do anticipate that we're going to continue to have a need for ongoing consolidation. And that's across a variety of healthcare and social services sectors. So, we are seeing it in hospitals. We're seeing it certainly in senior living. We're seeing it in, home health, home care, all of those different healthcare related entities. And one of the challenges with being a smaller, less resourced organization is being able to recruit and retain the staff and the workforce. So Workforce rose to prominence. I mean, that's been healthcare workers and social services, mental health workers have been a focus for a number of years, but they really elevated in terms of priority, in terms of their assets. And we know that for a number of years, the recruitment and retention is really going to be top of mind for organizations. We do have a pressured and permanently changed healthcare environment. Just this week, I was reading of additional, I'm going to call them waivers, that may not be the right thing, but approvals for hospital at-home programs. Each year that goes by, and this is not a new thing, but the number of health systems that were testing and approved to test hospital at-home platforms just year over year grew dramatically. So we are continuing to see this migration to where can we transfer in a safe environment, cost-conscious environment with similar outcomes, care in the home in the greater community. We know that the pandemic has increased the need for social services, so whether it's the homeless population we know has dramatically increased as unemployment has risen, so the need for meals, childcare services, mental health. So unfortunately, the suicide rates are not looking so great. The deaths due to overdose in 2020 were not so great. So all of those, this pandemic really exposed a lot of our societal vulnerabilities and escalated them in the past year. And we are seeing economic disparities. I referenced the high levels in the stock market and very healthy housing market, but that's a certain segment of our population. You've got other people that live, on the margin, and they are out of a job now, and their life is very different right now. So those economic disparities are real, and I think will continue to need to be addressed. One silver lining, and there are some, but one of them has been technology. Boy, when you look at advancement in technology and talk about investments, I think a year ago, many of us wish we had a crystal ball of where to put our money, because we could have done very well with some of the publicly traded companies. When you look at telehealth companies doing very well, the publicly traded home health, hospice home care companies are doing very, very, very well. So, and technology really has been one of the silver linings for COVID-19. So I referenced some of the mortality statistics. This is just sort of I think an interesting FYI, because I think it paints a picture of, again, where we are. And some of this does pivot and shift really our outlook moving forward. So 2020 was a record year in the U.S. for overall deaths. So usually an annual increase year over year is 20 to 15,000. So our population grows generally each year. But that growth, or that increase, was significant year over year. So when you look at 2019 through to 2020, there's an increase of about 400,000 versus 20 to 50,000 deaths of what we typically see. That was the largest single year increase in deaths since 1918, which is interesting. What do we know? What was that? That was the Spanish flu, and also some wartime deaths and so forth as well. So from 17 to 18, we actually saw a 47% increase. So the 15% actually doesn't look too bad compared to back then. I referenced suicide deaths dropped from 2018 to 2019. So we were actually starting to see declining figures, but the early information, I think the latest data was through October for 2020. It's not showing good figures there. And then drug overdose deaths are up significantly in 2020 as well. So it's actually the highest number ever recorded in a one-year period, and that was just May 2019 through May 2020. So we'll see where some of the year-end data plays out. So these are reality, not the sort of the brightest message and so forth, but I think these are just some realities to be aware of. What's also been interesting, and again, some year-end data still needs to come out, because some of these recent studies have been through the summer and early fall, but we know that there's been an outmigration from some of the larger urban areas, and particularly the more expensive urban areas. So the New York City, the Chicago, the San Franciscos of the world, and so forth. So density has been not a good thing during COVID-19. What remains to be seen is how many of these are temporary housing moves versus permanent. So, we will continue to pay attention to that, but we most do anticipate that there's going to be a semi-permanent shift at least to the what's called smaller urban markets, out from the big, expensive urban markets in urban areas. But again, this is a story of people that generally are in a middle to upper income level. The low income and homeless in urban and rural areas are less likely to have these options to move and to pivot. So this is, so that's a little bit of a just general reflecting back on the past year. So what does this light at the end of the tunnel look like? If it can be a little murky, a lot of it is a lot of question marks and uncertainty. But as we look to a new area of not-for-profit healthcare and social service ministries, what are things to think about? So 2020 definitely has been a year of disruption and turmoil, and a lot of hot topics coming to the forefront with diversity, equity, inclusion, and all of you as an association are very much focused on that. I specifically pulled out data as it relates to COVID because we have that. And this is nursing home information, but we know that these patterns apply to the population as a whole as well. So we know that, while Black residents of nursing homes and Hispanic residents of nursing homes we're generally not more likely to get COVID-19, a little higher, but not dramatically. They were more likely to die of it than the white residents that were in nursing homes. So those are definitely things that has garnered attention in the industry, and trying to figure out, how can we prevent some of this moving forward and better understand it in the data. So I think we're going to continue to see some information coming out around this particular piece related to COVID-19, as well as other issues. We know many organizations are hiring diversity officers and so forth, and we've seen that increase, particularly in the Fortune 500 organizations. I mentioned technology being a silver lining. So technology adoption absolutely accelerated, and a lot of it was out of need. So 2020 was all about speed, right? So it's speed, rushing to adoption. We're hopeful that 2021 is going to be taking it to the next level. It's going to be refining it. It's going to be the year of hopefully innovation. So, what we did see is a number of organizations that, rushed into adopting something or put something together that was sort of telehealth, but it really was just a tablet talking to somebody else or doing therapy and then mental health services, whatever it may be. This is the year to really take it to the next level. So one of the other things on the technology side is, and this is here to stay, our society has shifted to an on-demand society, when it wants it, where it wants it, and how it wants it. So this multimodal on-demand mindset is something that we need to think about. So the multiple devices is, all right, so I can have telehealth or connect with you on my phone. I may have a smart TV, my tablet, my computer. So that's this multimodal mindset, and then it's the on-demand. So when you think of maybe educational services you might be providing, even you think of church services, it's, many of you probably are experiencing this now. We can either watch the streaming, or we could be in person, or, a couple different midpoints to that. So think about your organization and think about, how does this apply to us? And if you are in the mindset of just sitting and waiting for this to pass, you're going to be behind the 8 ball. So change is the one thing that's very predictable, and you're going to need to change and start to integrate some of these things in a really meaningful way. And then just this living in a telepresence world, we talk a lot about telehealth and telemedicine, but it's really telepresence. Everything is telepresence, right? So it's, again, the ability for your staff to work from home. It is social connectedness. It's education. It's healthcare. So we definitely see that continuing to elevate and evolve throughout the next year. Services in the home. So we have many respects, whether it's mental health services, whether it is long-term care services. We've really entered the pandemic heavy on the facility-based side, and we still recognize and know the value of that face-to-face interaction. But the big question is, when we are able to open up and have full freedom to be in person in these various settings providing services, what percentage are going to choose to do that? And what's your platform going to look like? One of the things that I show here in the graph at the bottom, which may be a little hard to read, and spend a few minutes, you'll all have access to this PowerPoint, but spend a few minutes looking at it. So what it shows is really referrals coming out. It's the post-acute referrals coming out of a hospital. So hospitals, where are they discharging you if you need some services? And you can see the big drop there in April of 2020, and then it has rebounded since then as hospitals are taking on more elective surgeries and they opened back up gradually as well. But the number of referrals to skilled nursing facilities has stayed low. Now, some of that has been because they've been shut down for admissions. That depends on the state and so forth. But what has spiked up is the home health agency patient referrals. So is that going to be, again, a permanent shift? On the right-hand side, I just have various services that we do see shifting to, in the home, and these are schools offering counseling services. These are mental health, behavioral health. I will actually tell you mental health, behavioral health had been advancing in telehealth way before any other sector for many years. Probably 5 years ago, I went to the American Telemedicine Association conference, and I was amazed by the number of sessions and vendors and solutions all around mental health. So that train had left the station for a period of time, and so they're a little more mature than some of the other avenues. But companion services, the bottom right-hand side, the social isolation has been a big detriment to our society, and it's thinking of how can we either use technology or other avenues to mitigate that. So that we have been seeing it definitely with older adults, a lot of the clients that we work with, but also children with schools. There's an increase in a lot of the depression among some of the school-age kids that are sitting just at their laptop every day and not able to have those social interactions. And the one big area has been the developmentally disabled, some of those special populations. We have seen a significant decline. So how can some companion services, in whatever form that looks like, help mitigate some of that social isolation? I referenced the fact that it's not getting any easier. So we are going to continue to see consolidation. We often say that, what did the pandemic expose? Well, this is one of them. Those with scarce resources and really limited options have struggled. And we know that there's some significant financial pressures for a number of organizations because of the pandemic. And we're also seeing a lot of it, what we call C-suite. So whether it's your executive director, your CEO, CFO, retiring, because it's time to retire because they're burnt out. And, we know the baby boomer statistics. We've got 10,000 people hitting 65 years old a day. These are our leadership team. And who do we have to fill that pipeline? So a lot of those are spawning some consolidation conversations. I mentioned workforce as well. And again, this varies. It depends on your market, who else is there, what the competitive front looks like, what reimbursement looks like, and then just the strategic mergers and affiliations. Those conversations, there's nothing wrong with having those conversations. That is part of being a leader in your organization. Doesn't mean you need to pursue all of them, but what you do need to do as a leader is not wait too long. And that's been a big concern of ours for a long period of time, because you have limited options if you wait too long or in too much of the distress situation. So the workplace, talk about economics and outlook. If you take a look at office spaces, just go around your neighborhood or wherever you are and all of the lease signs, and many organizations saying we may not need the footprint that we need or that we have now. We are seeing higher costs across the board. So when minimum wage hikes are increasing, cost of benefits, the recruitment, the retention, the cost of turnover. And again, that's regardless of what sector. We are feeling that without a doubt. And, while we appreciate the support too of the additional monies on the unemployment side from the government, many have also said that makes it harder sometimes than to staff and bring certain people back when things do open up. Workforce fatigue and burnout is a real issue. So when you talk about mental health needs, a lot of that is the workers that have had to adjust. I referenced retirements, and then you always taught your children and the kids in college as they come into the workforce is make eye contact, shake a hand, and in a firm professional handshake. Well, that's a workplace, I think, thing that's going to be gone for a period of time. And then just around workplace fatigue and burnout, I just pulled here a quote that I think is interesting. And then it just really speaks to the need to find sort of that Sabbath space and that time. And we know a number of companies in 2020 were mandating that their staff took the time off, because there's never been a good time to take it off, and there never is, but mandating that they do that for their mental health. So it's just here, we need to stop glamorizing, the overwork and the absence of sleep, good diet, exercise, relaxation, and time with family and friends isn't something to be applauded. Too many people wear that burnout as a badge of honor, and it needs to change. This is just a woman, Katie Leeson. You can check her out, that she speaks a lot around leadership and some of these issues. So what are some additional predictions for 2021? Then we're going to sort of morph into Tommy here on the financial side of things. So a lot of focus on wellness and prevention. That's going to define a lot of our business, our models moving forward, regardless of what sort of service line and mission you are in. And a lot of it is bringing that to the consumer where they are, rather than them coming to you. So whatever that looks like, whether it's primary care, whether it's specialists, whether it's mental health, you know, and this can be easier for some populations than others, but it's this shifting mindset, you know, without a doubt. I referenced social isolation, you know, dramatic negative consequences. So, you know, how can we work through that and really try to mitigate some of that, even if we are through a year of 2021 where we're still in a period of some lockdowns and restrictions. And then caregiving is difficult and it's dwindling. So we know that the ratio of unpaid family caregivers drops dramatically in the coming years. I mean, very dramatically each year between now and 2030. As the population ages, there are fewer people there to care for older adults. You know, one of the things to know is that the biggest proportion of individuals that have exited the workforce in 2020 through their own decision has been middle-aged females. And why is that? Because they're taking care of their children at home, and they're also taking care of the mom and the dad and so forth. So it's interesting to see how some of that caregiving has impacted, again, the workforce in general. But we know with older adults that, you know, that baby boomer cohort is a higher proportion of individuals with no children. They're also more likely to be divorced or have never been married. So who's going to care for that aging population? And then I call it the COVID-19 baby bust. I don't know if others are using that term, but we are seeing a dramatic decline in births and pregnancies in 2020 here in the U.S. So the U.S. is estimated to have almost 500,000 fewer births in 2021 than a typical year. So it's pretty amazing to see how, again, it'll be interesting to see that I like my graphs and my data and so forth to sort of see how that dips and drops once we start to track some of the 20 and 2021 birth data. Fundraising, I'm not going to do a whole lot into this. I'm not a subject matter expert, but I know many of you, fundraising is a big part of your budget, and you've had to really shift to virtual strategies, and those in-person galas or fundraising events or whatever it may be are being replaced by virtual events, and you know, need to continue to think about what that looks like in 2021. Now, there's been there's been a certain proportion of donors, and you see this in terms of tips to restaurant workers and so forth, that have given more than usual. Some have had to stop, but some that are committed givers have actually been giving more in 2020 because of that. And there's been a bit of a shift towards not-for-profits, healthcare, social services, away from some other issues in the past that have gotten more money, like the environment, and there's some others. You can find some research and data out there. So that's a good thing, but again, there's been some variation without a doubt. So those recurring donors are going to be important than ever, and it's meeting your sponsor or your supporters on their turf. So whether that's Facebook, Instagram, social media, all of those different areas, and live streaming content, you've got to be nimble in your approach to that. So those are some of my predictions for 2021 and our predictions. And Tommy, I'm going to hand it over to you, and just going to ask him to start off with some general comments on what we're observing. We do not have crystal balls around economic outlook and forecast for 2021, but are generally hearing from what some others are saying. And then he's going to talk about, as we have a change in administration, any outlook for, PPP funds, additional stimulus. So Tommy, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and it's certainly great to be in front of you today. Again, we're sitting here in early January, and we'll be with you live in March. So we hope things continue to evolve for the positive between January and March. But, a couple of things. My background is I actually started in hospital accounting, and I'm a CPA by trade and got into banking. And so I'm an accountant in heart, and it has been very interesting to watch some of my peers out there in the industry on the provider side, the struggles that have taken place over the past year, more particularly, the last 6 months, as people look towards 2021 and how has that impacted their business. And it's been pretty significant. We as accountants like to have certainty, and we like to, 2 + 2 = 4. And in today's world, we're having to, adapt that a bit. And what I mean by that is, for instance, it used to be people were pretty firm with their budgets. You came up with an annual budget, and that generally stayed true for the entire year, recognizing that there were going to be changes during the year, but you were shooting in it. They were aspirational in nature, but they were formulated behind what you think would happen for a 12-month period. Well, many organizations now we see are doing budgeting as frequently as monthly. Quarterly is probably the most common, every 6 months in some instances, but very few are doing just a strict annual budget. So we're seeing folks acknowledging that, especially in 2021, that things in the early part of the year versus the latter part of the year may be dramatically different, and they're taking that into account from a budgeting perspective. A lot of clients believe COVID for at least the first 6 months of 2021 is going to have at least as big of an impact on their financial results as it did for the latter part of 2020, and they're budgeting accordingly. So the first half of the year generally is pretty consistent with what they've experienced over the last couple months. And then, of course, the hope is that the latter part of 2021 we'll be able to go back to what we don't know yet, but then what the new normal will be. The other factor that we want to point out is, and I'll talk a little bit in detail about the stimulus programs, but they've been a dramatic impact to the marketplace. I focus mostly on senior living financings, but this is all across the board. No matter what services you're providing, the stimulus programs have likely had a material impact on your operations. And the big question is that going to continue into 2021? We know that the PPP funding has been extended, and there is a round 2, which I'll talk about. But is that going to continue on to other programs, and what's going to be the end date on that? So it's foremost on people's minds, especially as they've received funds already, and now they're bringing it into their operations, and they're starting to utilize those. And in a lot of cases, they've exhausted those, so they're looking to the next round. But Lisa, transitioning to maybe more on the governmental programs, what I've listed here are what I believe are the main programs that have been utilized by a lot of our providers. I continue to be amazed. We've done about 6 or 7 specific CARES Act type programs for our clients, and the questions are still eagerly forthcoming. There are lots of questions out there. There's a lot of confusion. However, there's also a lot of gratitude that these programs are there, because they're really providing a stimulus that is desperately needed. And what I've seen more here over the past couple of weeks, the calls have been coming in about, hey, Tommy, what other programs out there should we be looking at? We've kind of gone through the traditional ones. Are you aware of any other non-traditional programs? But as far as, the main programs we see, you'll see for the healthcare providers, initially there was the accelerated advance payment for the Medicare providers. What Medicare was doing is they were providing you with an advance. That was discontinued pretty early. There has been some thought about that maybe coming back, but as of now, it hasn't. I think a lot of us know about the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. That is something that was on the front end of this in March and April of last year. A lot of folks took advantage of that. Again, not as heavily utilized now because most of those programs have been exhausted. Unfortunately, the deferral of employee payroll tax was something that was used by most every one of our clients, but that came to end at December 31st, 2020. What that was is you were able to defer the employer portion of payroll taxes. You didn't have to make that deposit in 2020 with the thought of you make 50% of that payment in 21 and 50% in 22. It's going to be interesting to see if we get some relief on that, whether that may be, that's one program that would be easy to extend into the coming year. A lot of folks, this wasn't a governmental program, but a lot of folks who have business interruption insurance were able to take advantage of that insurance program and actually draw some funds because their businesses were significantly interrupted and they met the qualifications to pull from their business interruption insurance. Unfortunately, that comes at the consequences. We're seeing a lot of angst with our providers trying to renew their insurances, and a lot of both the, not only health insurance, but the other insurance programs, whether it be property and casualty or business interruptions, have been seeing some significant increases. I hear numbers of 15 to 20% kind of being the norm of what they're seeing for general property liability and business interruption insurance increases. By far the biggest program that we've seen utilized is the Paycheck Protection Program. And for those that are healthcare providers, the provider relief funds, those two programs have been critical and instrumental to being able to weather, some of the storm that has occurred. And I'll talk about more detail about both those programs in a moment. There has been Fema Assistance. And thankfully, a lot of you who may have heard some of our webinars, there was a period of time where Fema Assistance was there, and it had the ability to pay for up to 75% of PPE equipment and other things. And we knew of a lot of folks, it's regulated more by states and localities. And we knew a ton of folks that had submitted applications, but we really hadn't seen a lot of cash that had made its way to the providers. Well, that changed in the month of December, and now into January. We're seeing FEMA really provide some significant relief. So a lot of those folks who submitted applications have actually had their funds distributed to them. So if you haven't, I would take a look at the FEMA Assistance Program. The Main Street Lending Program is something that had a lot of optimism throughout the 2020, but unfortunately has not been utilized that much, primarily because the terms and conditions associated with the Main Street Lending Program are in some cases more onerous than you can get directly from a bank. So if you're not able to get it through a bank, then the Main Street Lending Program is fortuitous. But if you have another option to potentially get loans through a more traditional manner, that probably is going to be a better option for you. And then last is, there are state-specific programs that are both industry-based as well as geographically based. So we're aware of programs that each individual states have applied to those that have been most impacted. So I would definitely keep in touch with your state to see that those programs are evolving and they change. Some of them have been around early in the pandemic and went on hibernation for a while, and now are coming back. So it's something that continues to evolve. So if we advance to real quickly talk about the Paycheck Protection Program, I don't want to dwell on the historical program too much. I think we're very familiar with what happened in 2020. It was a very significant program that if you had 500 employees or less, you could qualify for up to approximately 2.5 times of your average monthly payroll with a cap of $10 million. It caused a fair amount of strife early on about the certification requirement that current economic uncertainty makes this loan necessary to support ongoing operations. I'll talk about that a bit. That's kind of rearing its head again as we're going through the forgiveness process. But the main advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program was if you met the stipulations of the program and you received funds and you used the proceeds accordingly, you could get it forgiven. And we're now in the process of going through that forgiveness. But it's really, if you meet those provisions, it is a grant more than a loan. Some of the other programs are structured more that you have to pay it back over time. But the Paycheck Protection Program is a grant if you meet the stipulations of the forgiveness. And speaking of the forgiveness, Lisa, if you advance, there has been a lot of time and effort put on the forgiveness process. Hopefully here in early March now, we've got a lot more clarity and we've actually seen some of the larger loans be forgiven. But it's a two-step process. The first step is you submit an application to your lender who provided you with the PPP loan. And then the lender will ask you a bunch of questions, primarily mathematically based. They're not going to ask about the certification. That's not the responsibility of the lender. The lender's responsibility is to make sure you adhere to the requirements of the loan as it relates to the how the funds were doled out and then how they were actually spent. And then once the local bank has comfort that you have actually used the funds appropriately, they will turn it over to the SBA. The banks have 90 days to review that application. And then once it turns over to the SBA, you have 150 days. The SBA will look at that. The Reality of the program is that for smaller loans, for loans less than $2 million, and certainly for loans less than $150,000, that process has gone extremely smoothly in most instances. We've seen most loans go through the banks fairly quickly and also go through SBA and be forgiven. As we sit here in early January, we're not aware of any loan greater than $2 million. We're aware of many applications that have been submitted, and we're aware of many banks that have cleared their process, but we're not aware of any instance where SBA has actually responded back with full forgiveness of the loan. Now, that's both-sided. We're not aware of anybody that's been denied, but we're also not aware of anybody that's been approved, and we suspect that's because the SBA has taken their time to make sure that they have a complete, understanding of the program. And at least if you advance, there was a form that came out over the last couple of months. It's Form 3510 for not-for-profits, 3509 for for-profits. And what that form is it is an indication of what SBA is going to be looking at as it relates to economic need. So they are asking a bunch of questions related to your organization. A lot of that is broken down into your nonprofit activity assessment and a liquidity assessment. And what they're asking questions such as, how is your 2020 operations compared to 2019? And what's your liquidity position, irrespective of the financial performance? So how much do you have in your endowment? And it typically ties back for not-for-profits to the 990 forms. So it's creating, obviously, organizations will be asked by the lenders to submit this information. If you haven't been asked, it's not your responsibility to submit it, but it's highly probable if you receive more than $2 million that you will be asked at one point in time by your lender to submit this form. You'll have 10 days once you've received it to submit it. And then that's going to be used, we believe, with the SBA in the determination of if your organization is eligible for forgiveness. There is some good news on the horizon as it relates to PPP, in that here in late December, early January, we've got more information on the second wave of this. So the government and the president has signed into law the ability to provide $284 billion in new funds, which is a significant amount of funds. It does have some new organizations that qualify. It's 501c3, C6 organizations, which are primarily Chamber of Commerce and other organizations that aren't necessarily service providers but are not-for-profits. And we anticipate receiving some new guidance here in the next couple of days. Again, we're in early January, so by the time you hear this, that'll be out. But the main stipulations within the Payroll Protection 2 program are really threefold. There are three things that are different about PPP 2 versus PPP 1. And the first is that to qualify, you have to have less than 300 employees, which is a reduction from the 500 employees from the first phase. The second is fairly significant in that you will have experienced economic hardship to the extent that your 2020 results for at least a quarter. So you can pick any quarter in 2020, but any quarter in 2020 compared to the same quarter in 2019, you have to have 25% reduction in gross receipts. And that's generally net patient revenue in the not-for-profit service provider world. So if you can show that your revenue is down 25% in 2020 compared to 2019, you qualify. But unfortunately, if you cannot show that dynamic, then you don't. The third change is that the PPP loans, round one was capped at $10 million. Round two is going to be capped at $2 million. But other than that, the programs, if you meet the qualifications, are going to be pretty similar. Advancing to the Provider Relief Fund, I think many of you on the phone, likely if your service providers, healthcare providers, received some fairly significant provider relief funds. It's been a monumental program to you. It's offset a lot of the lost revenues and costs you've had associated with your nursing operations. And it's been pretty impactful to a lot of organizations. There have been, at least if you advance to the next slide, there have been many different distributions. Many of you have probably received 4 or 5 different distributions. Some of them are ongoing, where there's an incentive distribution that for the months of September, October, November, and December that is specifically related to quality measures, such as how many cases have you had compared to your peers, and how many deaths have you had compared to your peers. So it's something that's ongoing, and it's in most instances we've been able to tie back specifically to the amount of funds you've received. That's with the exception of the incentive payments. The incentive payments is at a very complex mathematical formula. And unfortunately, a lot of folks have not been able to figure out exactly why they got that amount. But for all the other targeted and general distributions, we know exactly how much you received and why. The big issue as it relates to the provider relief funds is that there is a reporting requirement associated with them. You would have had, if you received funds by February 15th, you would have had submitted your first report. So you now sitting here in early March, you've likely submitted that, which is a accounting of what has occurred through December 31st, 2020. And to the extent you have not used all of your funds, you'll have another accounting responsibility by the end of July, which will be for the period ended June 30. So there is a reporting requirement. We hope to get some additional clarity on that. But I think primarily if you can show that you've used those funds for coronavirus specific activities to include both expenses related to the coronavirus and lost revenue that you can specifically attribute to the coronavirus, I think you will be likely okay through your reporting requirements. And again, if you've, the sunset of that is going to be June 30, 2021. Will that be extended? We don't know, but kind of in summary, at least if you want to advance a couple slides, that's the reporting requirement there. But as it relates to, we do have a resource center, so please feel free to go out there to the Ziegler Resource Center we try to keep that as updated as possible. But, in summary and closing, one of the things that we do feel that's exceptionally important as it relates to the financial results is to stay on top of these programs, because we have seen organizations miss opportunities. And it's unfortunate because you guys have so much on your plate that it's tough to keep up with everything. But those annoying emails you get from probably accounting firms and law firms and investment banking firms like ours, I would at least scroll through those, because as has been proven over the last 9 months, new programs pop up frequently, and also qualifications for those programs change over time. For instance, the Provider Relief Fund initially did not include assisted living facilities, but then it did include assisted living facilities. So that's an example of somebody who, if they just dismissed the program initially, they may not have gotten a benefit, and they might have missed the application deadlines once it became open. So I would stay in contact with your banking team, your accountants, your attorneys, to make sure you're taking advantage of this program. So, Lisa, back over to you.
Yeah, great. It's such good information, Tommy, and we know for all of you, it's a constantly moving set of programs and funds, and the accounting alone, I think, is a lot to take on. But appreciate that overview and the outlook. So at this point, we appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you. We're going to stop the PowerPoint and transition into the conversation. So thank you very much. Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I think Tommy should be joining in a little bit. That's always, I don't know if anybody's ever been in that spot, but watching yourself being recorded is so uncomfortable. So hopefully that was good for all of you and helpful.
Yes. First, I want to just thank you and Tommy for being here, being sponsors. Ziegler is always a great supporter of Chisholm. And so now we're going to open up for Q&A. I do know when you mentioned earlier in the life expectancy trends, there was an interest in hearing a little bit more than that. So maybe if we want to start off with that, and then people can type in other questions that they may have.
Yeah, and I'm going to put a link in here actually for a report that just came out. And I will tell you, this was released beginning of February, let's say a month ago. And it was around the life expectancy, which actually showed that there's been a dip in life expectancy. And I will tell you, there's been some really ever so slightly dips the last 2 years. And there's been a lot of theories around that. There's been a lot of hypotheses specifically around the role of opioid addiction and deaths related to that. The interesting thing in this report, now I will tell you that this is only data through June. So there's a lot of, what I will say, research limitations to it. And they get into that with reporting and so forth. So I think that there's a partial COVID conversation, but that's not the full conversation. Check out the report. It's a little technical, but if nothing else, there's some interesting visuals in there. The one thing that I will point out, and I know I shared a slide on the nursing home statistics by race. When you look at this latest information around life expectancy by race, there are significant differences. And I'm just going to real briefly, I have it pulled up here, I'm just going to read. Actually, the non-Hispanic Black male life expectancy dropped 3 years from 2019 to 2020. 3 years. That is almost unheard of in just a year-over-year change. Hispanic males dropped almost 2.5. Non-Hispanic Black females 2.3 years. So it's the non-Hispanic white men and women that dropped the least, but really all racial groups did show some decrease. But we are seeing this really even growth in some of the racial inequities with some of these statistics that have been coming out lately. So I sent you that report. You can check it out. And I think there's a lot more to that story, and we'll continue to watch it. But I did want to mention that.
Yeah, as Mike chatted, wow, that's what I would think for those life expectancies. Tommy, there was a question earlier for you about, is the Main Street lending program related specifically to communities that are certified Main Street communities?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. And George, the Main Street program is actually a program that's regulated by size. So not necessarily, you don't have to be any particular program member currently. You just have to fit a certain size bucket. And that size bucket is very large. So I think most organizations certainly qualify for that. The ones that typically don't are the Fortune 500 type companies. But yeah, the Main Street program is out there and available to most folks. As I mentioned, we haven't seen a lot of utilization in that program, primarily because it's a pretty stringent program where you've got to, fit yourself into a pretty narrow box. And if you do that, even if you fit in a narrow box, the terms of that loan aren't necessarily much better than what you would get if you just went down to the local financial institution. So what I'm trying to say is that that's a good program for sure, but it's really a lender of last resort, where if you can't get, a loan elsewhere, then definitely should pursue that one.
Another question was, can you say a little more about the FEMA opportunities for PPE?
Yeah, the FEMA actually has a program out there that allows for reimbursement up to 75% of supplies and other COVID type expenses. The difficulty associated with the FEMA program is it's governed by states. So each state is different. There isn't one form you can go out to across the country. It's more locally regulated. And some states, I'm aware of a couple multi-state providers who have had tremendously positive experiences in one state and have struck out in another. So they kind of submitted the same application process and did the same thing, but were successful in one state, but unfortunately received no funds in another. So if you want to shoot me an email or something, I will, not sure what state you're in, but I would reach out to someone locally there, about the FEMA process, because it's initially I thought it was a wild goose chase, to be honest with you, because I knew a lot of folks who applied and they just didn't get any responses. And all of a sudden the responses came, and I'm aware of a couple organizations that received a lot of hundreds of thousands of dollars to the FEMA program. So it really has been impactful for those that have been able to get it.
She's in Illinois, but she can reach out to you if
Okay.
you don't know that specifically right
Yeah,
now.
I appreciate that, Lee. And I'm not up to speed on Illinois, but let me do some digging there.
Okay. And then there was a question, do either of you have any predictions on how churches are doing and affected?
I will just tie it to some of the
the trends that we talked about. So everything from the telepresence, the virtual platforms, and so forth, that has really weaved its way into the church community as well. Not that that's a new thing where services have been live streamed or so forth, but for some it has been, and case in point, my church. And I don't know the numbers, and I'm personally curious about this as well, but I know at least, let's say a year ago, 9 months ago, that churches were saying that they were seeing a significant increase in interest. Now that may have been a little bit of, is the world ending and I'm rushing to God or whoever. But so I know in the beginning there was a significant uptick. I don't know how that has gone because, and again, this is a state by state, region by region. Some churches are open for in-person services, some are not. But I think just like whatever setting you are in, I think when things do go back to some normal or increased capacity for in-person offerings, there's going to continue to be that virtual where you can watch the church service on demand whenever you want it. It's going to be uploaded to YouTube, or you can be there in person. And I think inherent in that to me is opportunity. And whether you're a church or a senior living provider or children and youth, that there's an opportunity to touch more people that way if you're doing it the right way. So I don't have any stats, but I think a lot of the things we talked about are just as applicable with the church settings as well.
Yeah, one of the, Lee, before Donna, one of the things that surprised me, because we were doing another presentation where I kind of got into the fundraising side of things, specifically how we're related to senior living. And I was surprised to find out that there were both more in dollar volume and more in individual donations made in 2020 than in any other period in history. And that made some sense to me, because I'm sure that there was some health-related donations that were made, but it was also cross-sector. So what I gather from that, Donna, is that there are some organizations that have had quite robust and successful 2020 fundraising campaigns, and like everything else, I'm sure there's some that have struggled. But I was surprised in the amount of philanthropy that existed in 2020, and I think that did carry over to the church environment. So just was surprising to me.
And I do think that the consolidation conversation that we had earlier too applies to the churches as well. But again, if you look back, I mean, that's not necessarily a completely new trend. Those are things that we have been seeing. And honestly, when we spend a lot of time, obviously, in senior living, and if you said a year ago, we are going to pay, we need you to write down right now your best guess of the 10 organizations that are going to have the most trouble. Those are the organizations now that are having the most trouble. So, I'd be surprised if there was, whether it's a church or a social service agency or, a senior living organization that, wasn't maybe struggling a little bit or starting to see some red flags a year ago. And really COVID, the pandemic has been a little bit of a breaking point. So we're seeing those, some churches close and some congregations come together for sure.
Yeah, and Cindy, that's an interesting point. Again, Lisa and I, area of expertise is not necessarily church financings or anything, but the 1 in 3 churches are predicted to close. And I'm wondering if that's pandemic stress, financial, or other. I wonder if the otherwise is how many of those would have been in difficulty pre-pandemic. So not knowing that, but again, I certainly don't want to represent that the fundraising for churches are up or down, because I certainly don't know that. But I will say that in general, fundraising was up, and I hope churches were able to capitalize on at least some of that.
Well, I hate that we have to wrap this up since there are more questions. I'm sorry, Stacy, we didn't get to your question, but I do want to thank Lisa and Tommy once again for being with us and taking the time to do the presentation and then be here for the live Q&A. And now I need to turn it over to Elise to give some announcements.